My name is Lena Robinson, and I am 81 years old. The Roads of New York, The Long Journey of Lena Robinson. Harlem Beginnings, 1940s to 1950s. Sometimes, when the evening light spills across my apartment walls and the city hums below, I feel the years folding back like pages in a book. Harlem, that's where my story begins. I was born in 1944 in a narrow brownstone on 127th Street. Harlem back then was a heartbeat, the kind you could hear through the walls, through the pavement, through people's laughter and cries. Mama, Dolores Robinson, was a church singer, and Daddy, Walter, worked long nights at the post office. We didn't have much, but the world we lived in had a rhythm. And rhythm, child, can carry you farther than money sometimes. I still remember the sound of Mama humming, "Take My Hand, Precious Lord," while hanging laundry by the fire escape. Daddy would come home tired, loosen his tie, and say, "Baby girl, the world may be heavy, but don't let it crush your smile." The building smelled of old wood, frying fish, and sometimes perfume from the lady upstairs who always had visitors after dark. Harlem was alive. It was noisy and poor and beautiful, all at once. When I was 10, I'd sit by the window and make up stories about the people I saw. The man with the saxophone who played near the corner, the woman selling flowers with her baby tied to her back. Mama said I had a sparkle in me, that I saw the world softer than most. But when Daddy lost his job at the post office, that sparkle dimmed for a while. I remember nights when Mama cried in the kitchen, thinking I was asleep. I remember Daddy's silence. And I remember realizing for the first time that even the strongest people can crack. Still, every Sunday, Mama sang, and when she sang, the walls of that tiny apartment felt like heaven's gates opening. Those songs stitched hope into me, hope I would carry my whole life. Teenage years, the dreamer in the city, 1958 to 1963. By 16, I was a tall, lanky girl with wild curls and a stubborn will. Harlem was changing. Civil rights marches, jazz in every corner, young people believing the world could be reshaped. I worked weekends at Miss Hattie's Diner, a small place where the jukebox never stopped and the smell of biscuits filled the air. I'd save every penny I earned in a coffee tin under my bed, dreaming of one day going to college, maybe becoming a writer. I'd write poems on napkins, little stories about the customers I served, the lonely man who always asked for extra sugar, the women who argued over pie slices. Sometimes I'd sit on the fire escape with my notebook, feeling the night air on my skin, watching the glow of lights in the windows opposite mine. Harlem was a living storybook. I just didn't know I'd become one of its sad chapters. That's when I met Marcus. He was 23, a jazz musician with eyes that sparkled like secrets and a voice smooth enough to melt steel. He'd come into the diner every Friday, order black coffee, and tell me I had the kind of smile that could start a song. At first I laughed it off, but he had this way of making the world feel slower, like it was just the two of us floating in music. He took me to smoky jazz clubs, taught me to listen, really listen, to the story a saxophone could tell. For a while, I thought I was in love. Then one morning, he was gone. Just gone. No letter, no call. His band went on tour down south, and that was it. That pain burned deeper than I knew possible, but it was the fire that made me write. I poured my heartbreak into words. I wrote, "He left, but he took my song with him." Early adulthood, chasing independence. 1964 to 1975. In my 20s, I traded heartbreak for ambition. The 1960s in New York were fierce. Civil rights marches, protests, and a wave of energy that made even the air feel electric. I joined a secretarial course downtown, where I was often the only black woman in the room. I wore my best skirts, polished my shoes, and carried myself like I belonged, even when I wasn't sure I did. Eventually, I got a job at a publishing office near Times Square. I can still remember my first day, the hum of typewriters, the smell of coffee, the sharp clicks of heels on tile. That's when I met David Green. He wasn't like Marcus. David was quieter, steadier, a photographer from Brooklyn with a crooked smile and eyes that seemed to understand silence. One afternoon, he caught me reading Langston Hughes on my lunch break and said, "That's my favorite poet too." It started there, slow, easy, real. We married in 1968 in a courthouse with 2 witnesses and rain falling outside. We had no fancy rings, but when he held my hand, it felt like the world made sense again. Our first apartment was tiny, a 1-bedroom near Bedford-Stuyvesant with peeling paint and a window that faced a brick wall. But it was ours. We laughed, danced, cooked rice and beans, dreamed of children. Then came the miscarriages. 2 of them. Each one felt like a piece of my heart being quietly taken. David tried to be strong, but I could see the grief in his eyes too. Money grew tight. His photography business struggled, and I took on extra shifts at the office. Some nights I'd come home to find him staring at old film reels, whispering, "Maybe I'm not good enough." And some nights I'd stand in the kitchen, hands trembling, whispering the same thing about myself. Middle age. Between love and survival. 1976 to 1995. Time changes love. It doesn't always kill it, but it reshapes it into something quieter, sometimes lonelier. By the late 70s, Harlem's golden glow had faded. Drugs and poverty had taken over corners that once sang with jazz. Rent rose, streets grew rougher, and dreams began to shrink. David started drinking. It began with whiskey on weekends and grew into bottles hidden behind the sink. I tried to save him, but sometimes people don't want saving. When Mama passed in 1983, I felt the floor vanish beneath me. She had always been my compass. I held her hand as she slipped away, whispering, "You did good, Mama. You gave me everything." The night after her funeral, I came home to find David's camera bag by the door and a note on the table. "Lena, I need to find myself again." He left for California. No calls, no letters, just a silence that echoed for years. It took me a long time to forgive him, and even longer to forgive myself for holding on. But out of that pain, something new grew. I took night classes in creative writing. I started reading at poetry cafes in Harlem, my trembling voice finding courage through words. People would come up after and say, "Lena, your words sound like healing." Maybe they were. I learned that even broken things can bloom again, just not always the way they were before. Later years, the quiet bloom. 1996 to 2015. By my 50s, life had slowed its storm. I moved to a small apartment near Brooklyn Heights, where the river breeze carried the smell of salt and memory. I adopted a gray cat I named Billie Holiday, because she sang to herself when it rained. I started teaching writing workshops to kids at a community center, children from broken homes with eyes too old for their age. I told them, "Your story matters. Even if no one listens, write it anyway." Watching them learn, seeing their pride, it healed something in me. In 2004, one of my students published his first book and thanked me in the dedication. I cried that night, not from sadness, but from fullness. At 60, I traveled to Paris alone. I sat by the Seine River, the light shimmering on the water, and whispered to Mama, "I made it, Mama. I really did." That trip taught me that joy doesn't need witnesses. It just needs acceptance. The Stranger on the Subway, 1997. It was winter, the kind that turned New York gray and quiet. I remember because the wind that year bit through every coat I owned. I was riding the subway home from work, half asleep, clutching my tote bag full of papers from my writing class. A man sat across from me, middle-aged, wearing a frayed coat and a worn-out look. Something about his eyes stopped me. They were tired but kind. When he noticed me looking, he smiled slightly and said, "You ever wonder where everyone's going in such a hurry?" I laughed softly. "All the time." He nodded, looked down at his hands. "You ever stop running?" I thought for a moment and said, "Only long enough to catch my breath." We talked until my stop. He told me he used to be a teacher, but lost everything to addiction. His job, his family, his home. He said he was trying to rebuild, one day at a time. When the train slowed, I reached into my bag and handed him one of my poems, a short one about second chances. He read it quietly, folded it, and said, "Thank you. I'll keep this. Maybe I'll start again." I never saw him again. But months later, as I was walking down the street near that same station, Someone had written on the wall in chalk, "Start again. You can always start again." I smiled. Maybe that was him. It reminded me that sometimes you don't save people by fixing them. You save them by believing they still can be fixed. 8. The letter that found me. 2002. In 2002, something strange happened. A letter arrived, yellowed around the edges, addressed to me, but sent from California. It was from David. I stared at it for hours before opening it. Inside was a single page written in shaky handwriting. "Lena, I hope you're well. I've carried the weight of leaving for far too long. I wanted to say I'm sorry, not just for leaving you, but for letting my own fear of failure break what was beautiful. I found peace in photography again. I even teach now. I keep a photo of you from 1972, the one by the window, sunlight on your face. If you ever find it in your heart, think of me kindly." By David. I read that letter 100 times. I didn't write back, not because I was angry, but because forgiveness doesn't always need an audience. I placed the letter in my old photo album beside the picture he mentioned. It felt like closing a book that had been open too long. Sometimes healing isn't a reunion. It's a quiet acknowledgement that the story is over, and that's okay. 9. The Girl with the Yellow Notebook. 2006. I was teaching at a small community center then, mostly teenage kids who didn't think much of writing. They'd say things like, "Miss Lena, nobody cares about our stories." But there was one girl, Tanya, 15, shy, always in the back, always writing in a little yellow notebook. One day after class, she handed it to me and said, "Can you read this? I think it's bad." It wasn't bad. It was brilliant. It was raw, painful, and full of truth about her mother's drinking, her brother in jail, her dream to leave the projects and go to college. I told her, "Child, this is gold. You just don't know how much yet." She cried right there in front of me. She said no one had ever told her she was good at anything. Years later, in 2015, I got a package, a book titled Yellow Notebook by Tanya Rivers. The dedication read, "For Miss Lena Robinson, who taught me my words had wings." I hold that book like it was my own child. Sometimes your purpose isn't the life you build, it's the life you touch without even realizing it. The Storm of 2012. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York in 2012, it reminded me that even a city that never sleeps can be humbled. The power went out for days, streets flooded, people panicked. But something beautiful happened in that darkness. Neighbors talked again, strangers helped each other. I saw a young man wade through knee-high water just to bring food to an elderly woman in my building. I made coffee on a gas stove and passed cups to whoever needed warmth. And as I sat in candlelight, listening to the rain batter the windows, I thought, this is what we forget in the rush of life. It's not the big moments that define us. It's the quiet ones, when no one's watching, when all you have left is kindness. The reunion I never expected. 2017. It was a Sunday morning, warm and lazy. I was at a small Harlem bookstore reading poetry for a community event when a familiar face appeared in the crowd. It was Marcus. His hair was gray now, his hands trembling slightly, but those same soft eyes, older, gentler, regretful. After the reading, he came up to me. "You still write like you used to," he said, smiling faintly, "back when I thought I was the music." I laughed. "And now?" He sighed and said, "Now I know. I was just part of the song." We talked for an hour. He told me he had a family, 2 daughters, grandkids. He'd gotten clean, started teaching music to kids. Before he left, he said, "Lena, I never forgot you. You were my light when I was lost." I told him that maybe it was worth being lost for a while. I walked home that evening lighter than I have felt in years. Life has a funny way of looping back, not to repeat itself, but to remind you that you made it through. The last lesson. When the world went quiet during the pandemic, I felt that old loneliness again, the kind I hadn't felt since David left. Days blurred together. The city outside my window felt ghostly, silent, as if it too was holding its breath. I started writing again. Letters, journal entries, poems. I wrote to Mama, to David, to Marcus, to my younger self. Then one morning, I set up my old laptop and began recording short videos. Letters to the living, I called them. Little pieces of advice for anyone who needed an old woman's wisdom. One day, my neighbor's granddaughter helped upload those clips online. I didn't think much of it, but a week later, she said, "Miss Lena, you're going viral." Thousands of people were watching, commenting, writing things like, "You remind me of my grandma," or "Your voice calms me." It stunned me. At 81, I'd become an accidental voice for strangers. And I realized sometimes your story doesn't end where you think it does. It just changes form.